I'm Gary and welcome to my shop. In this video I'm going to show you how I made this taper jig, and I just made a cut that gives me a nice clean straight edge so I can use that as an edge against my fence for squaring up of the cuts that I want to make. You can also make tapered cuts if you want to make tapers like table legs or chair legs or whatever. You can also do that on there with this set up on the back side of here on this block on the back. I can change this, slide it over to position for different points for the bottom of the leg that you want to taper. And then you can keep this in point and use this as a pin to stay in the bottom of the leg. That way you can rotate the leg and keep getting perfect cuts every time that are equal to each other. And you don't have to be shimming in various parts in order to keep trying to get that exact same taper as you cut before. This will take care of it without having to go to those extra efforts. Now this jig is from the Woodsmith Shop, and used to be their Shop Notes magazine that they published. And it's a multi-purpose taper jig, and you can get this online yet from them. I think their plans are $4.95 a piece. Sometimes they have sales on them for about half price, so it depends what you can find at the time that you're looking. Unfortunately, I can't share them with you because that would be a copyright violation. It's fairly easy to make. Maybe it takes a couple hours to make it. I chose to do this because it offered me the options, especially with the tapered legs and stuff, without having to do a whole lot of extra setups and stuff. Now, Rockler does have one of these online, and I'll put the links in the description below. But Rockler has one for about $80. I already had most of the parts. All I had to order was really the T-tracks, and all the other parts I already had, except for a couple of small parts I had to pick up at my local Home Depot or Lowe's. Apart from that, I had most everything here, so it was a lot cheaper for me to make it myself. And also, part of being a woodworker is making our own jigs. We can kind of customize them to what we want or to a size that we want to accommodate what our needs are. Okay, here I'm looking at all the parts to make this taper jig, and this taper jig comes from the plans from Woodsmith Shop, the Shop Notes edition, number 114. I'll put a link in the description below to these plans. And basically, these are all the materials, exception of one part I haven't got yet, but I've got a workaround, and I found a source for getting that one piece. But I've got a piece of 3/4 plywood here, plenty wide enough and long enough to do this project for the two main pieces that I need. Then I've got a couple of T-tracks here that I ordered from Rockler, 4-foot and a 2-foot. This is all according to the material and supply listings in the plans here. So, also got the hold down clamps. I've got 4 of these T-slot bolts. 2 of these I got to cut down to size because they're a little bit too long. I've got 6 knobs that I happen to have left over from this package deal I bought from Woodpeckers one time. I got a bunch of them for a really good deal. Then I've got the knob for holding a guide. 6 washers that are 5/16, 2 washers that are 1/4 inch bolt for making a part for holding tapered legs and stuff, a elastic stop nut, got 2 brass threaded inserts that will screw into the wood. And I have a couple packages of number 6 by 1/2 inch screws. Now the plans in here, or the supply list, called for 3/8 inch number 6 screws, but I couldn't find them at Home Depot or Lowe's at that length, just a 1/2 inch. So I figure I'll get the holes started with these before I crank them down real tight. I'll take them back out and grind off the tips or file off the tips a little bit so it doesn't go through the wood on me. I don't want it to do that. Now one of the parts that I need is a T-slot nut. Now, I did find T-slot nut at Lee Valley Veritas for $6.20 for 10 of them, and I'll put the link in the description below. $6.20, but the shipping is like $7.95, $8. So I'm going to either find more things to order with that, or I'm just going to fashion my own T-nut out of this piece of aluminum. Now this T-nut doesn't really have to be subject to a lot of torque, not very much at all. So I can fashion a T-nut out of this and thread it with a 1/4 by 20 tap, and probably serve the purpose I need. I'll cut this to size to fit what I need. With that, we'll get on here and show you how I put all this together. Okay, on this board, I'm going to cut out the 2 main boards that I need for this jig, which is the base and the fence. So my first cut calls for 32-inch base. I'm cutting it about 33. I'm going to cut these oversized, and then I'll trim these down further to get some good clean cuts on them. Then the second cut is going to be a 31-inch, and I'm cutting it to 32 to give myself some room to clean up the cuts. I use my carpenter square just for rough cuts here. This gives me ability to make some good square cuts. You may see I've got this piece elevated above my tabletop so I don't cut into it. Now the other piece. Okay, next I'll cut these boards up to size and get good square cuts on them. Okay, so I'm going to cut some straight edges on this board and the other board. And I usually got one edge here, it's fairly straight. I'll kind of hold them up to my fence here to see what it's like. See, this one's got a bit of a bow to it. So I hold the other one around. That one's good and flat up to my fence. So I'll keep that on there, make a straight cut on this to get that straight. And then I will start working on cutting down the width of this and then cutting the ends to get them squared up. So this one I'm going to cut down to an 8-inch width. Okay, got a straight edge there. I'm going to cut this down to 5-inch width. So here are my two boards at an 8-inch and a 5-inch width. Now I'm going to trim these off and square them up to the correct length. Actually, since I've made a new fence here and I've got a 0 mark here, I can just align my cut to that rather than trying to eyeball up the blade. Okay, this board for the fence, I'm going to line at 31. Okay, so I've got the major cuts done on my two boards here for the base and the fence. Next I can work on putting the T-tracks in on these. I'm preparing to cut the dados for the T-tracks and the base. Now this is a test piece so I can get my blade set up to make sure I've got the correct width and depth for the T-track. So I set up the width of my dado stack blade here according to the width of the T-track. Then also I set the depth of the cut to be equal or just a little bit above the depth of the T-track so that it sits down in a little bit and not proud of the wood. Test cut brings it out, perfect fit, good and tight, and it's just a hair, maybe a 64th of an inch below the wood. So that's good, so nothing will catch on that. Next I will take my base piece that I'm going to use and cut the dados in there. There's 4 dados altogether, and I'll start out with that. First dado is at 1 inch from each end. Okay, now that I've got my dado stack set up for width and depth, this is my base piece that I'm going to use, and I've got the face facing down. That is the side that I'm going to put these T-tracks in, so I'll cut the dado through that. It's 1 inch in from the end, and then I'll cut this one, I'll flip the board around, cut the other one end for end to be 1 inch in. So I've got both these dados cut and good fit with my T-track, and I'll measure in now 9 inches to do the 2 middle cuts. Actually it's 9 inches from this edge to the edge of this dado, so measuring from my fence I'm actually measuring 11 inches there. Okay, so I've got these 4 dados cut out. Good fit with the T-track. It's going to work great. Next step, I'm going to be putting the runner along the bottom here that'll fit in the miter slots here. Okay, so my next step here is to make the runner for the bottom of my base for this taper jig. I've got this piece of, it's a red oak, it's a 1 by 2 inch, somewhere around there, laying around, so I'll use this. You want to use a hardwood for making a runner. Another alternative is you can buy runners online, and I'll put a link below for one with Rockler. It's about 30 bucks to get a 3-foot one, so you got at least enough length there for the 32-inch base on this. So $30, I'll make my own runners. So now this runner, you know, it fits really well into this miter slot. Good snug fit. But the problem is you take a look at how the wood grains here, if you can see that, and if you get any moisture in the air, humidity and stuff, you know, the wood expands. So with these kind of wood grains, your wart is going to expand like this. We don't want that, because then it'll cause you constriction and moving through your miter slot, and that's not going to work well through the seasons. Now you may adjust season to season or something, like trying to narrow that down when it gets tight, but then when the dry season comes along again, then you're going to have a loose fit in your miter slot, and that's not going to work for giving you accurate cuts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and turn this way, and I'm going to cut my length to be 3/4 inch to fit to the miter slot. And I'll sneak up on that cut to make sure it's a good tight fit. That way, if I get moisture in the air, humidity, you can see how these wood grains are running across here now. So then it's going to expand this way instead of sideways. So I won't have to worry about the humidity changes from season to season causing me restrictions on my jig moving freely. I have done some test cutting, and I've got a piece here that fits the slot pretty good now. It's a little bit snug, but I think that's as close as I want to get. And then I'll tweak it some more with some sandpaper when I cut my final piece here. Okay, with this I've got a good snug fit. Doesn't move back and forth either way, so this will be perfect. The next step is to cut this runner to 3/8 inch thick. I've got them cut so that they fit the miter slot, and I've got the grains running crossways on here. You have to pay close attention to that, because sometimes saw marks can throw you off as to where the real grains are at. So you got to look at that carefully. And then what I do is mark what's the top. It's going to fit in here. I put a T on here so I know it's the top. Then I will flip that over against the fence so that I'm not cutting the wrong grain direction. So I cut a test piece here, got that done, and fit into my miter slot here. Fits very well, and it sets just below the surface of my table saw, along with a very shallow dado that I'm going to cut in the bottom of the base on this taper jig. That will make this sit up a little bit so it's not making any contact on the bottom or bottoming out at all. So, got that set. Now I can cut my real piece. Got my top marks. I'm going to face that against the fence. Nice, perfect fit. Okay, I've set up my dado stack here to cut the shallow groove for the runner on the bottom of the base of this jig, and did some test cuts and got the width zeroed in. Very good. Good snug fit on this. So I'm ready to go ahead and cut the groove on this. I've lined up the marks according to the layouts where I was measuring according to the plans from an outer edge of the standard blade. I got the dado stack in here now, but the outer edge of the standard blade to the edge of the miter track is 4 3/4 inches. So I measured all that out to set up this, and I'll go and cut this. Yeah, it fits in pretty well. A little bit of a snug fit, so I might have to tweak it a little bit with a little bit of sanding, but I do want a good snug fit. I have tweaked this runner by sanding it with just some 120 grit until I got it to fit into here, into this groove. Good and tight and fit. And I've checked how this lines up with the saw blade and so forth on the table here. So it'll make where I can trim this off to be perfect with the saw blade. So my next step is to glue this in place. Just use a little bit of glue here. I don't want this squeezing out too much on me, but I'll spread it out with a brush, try and get good coverage. If I need to, I'll add a little bit more to it. Good tight fit, so it's going to hold pretty good. Now this glue is spreading pretty good. That's going to work great. I'll get this lined up here with the end. Get it pressed in place. I'll tap it down a little bit just to make sure it's well seated. You can hear how solid that sounds once it's seated. Okay, so I'm going to let this glue set up, and then I'm going to come back and install T-tracks in these. Before I put these T-tracks in, I'm going to go ahead and cut this to square this up with the blade and the miter slot. So now I've got this lined up, squared up to the blade, so that'll be perfect. I can put on these T-tracks. A couple of tips I wanted to pass on is that when you're lining up on where to put this runner on the bottom of the board, they tell you to measure from the outside edge of your standard blade here that you'll be using for cutting your tapers and stuff to outside edge of the tooth on the far side here to miter track here. And this one for the Ridgid R4512 measures at 4 3/4 inches. So it's a measurement you're going to need to know. You might want to double check yours to make sure that you're on correctly. Otherwise you may wind up too short and you won't be able to get a zeroed in cut for your blade. Another tip too is that I noticed when I was tightening up the knob here for the blade level to set for the dado stack that when I tightened the knob the blade would drop about 1/16 of an inch. I don't know if that's that way for many table saws or not, but this is the first time I really noticed it in all these years that I've used this, or if that's just a peculiarity of the Ridgid R4512. So after having cut the dado depths here for these T-tracks to go into, I can see what's left over here in depth, so that's why they call for the 3/8 inch screws. I did find some at Lowe's that were 3/8 with a flat head on top, Phillips drive. And these are a Hillman number 491267. Comes 7 in the package. I think this requires a total of 16 screws. So buy 3 packages and you got some left over. Now as far as cutting these to fit, this is a 2-foot T-track, and then I've got a 4-foot one yet. That will go onto the fence that goes on here yet. So what I want to do is just drive those screws in here. It's like 2 holes for each piece that I need here. This is 24 inches. These are 8 inch. So it means after taking off 1/8 of an inch for a saw kerf, these are going to be a little bit short. So I'll just kind of make them about 1/8 of an inch short here on this end. This end is not as critical as this end should be. So I can try and get these all kind of even. And then what I'm going to do is screw one in. I'm going to take it through the saw blade, cut it off, do the next one and cut it off, do the next one and cut it off, and the next one. Now since these screws are so small, I don't think I need to pre-drill these holes. And it being plywood, it's not that hard of wood. I'm just going to drive them in directly. Once it gets down there snug, you want to kind of hand tighten it. If you do a power, these are being such small screws, and especially being brass, they'll be easy to break. As you know, with carbide blades we can cut aluminum, so aluminum and brass, not a problem. Perfect fit. Now I'll do the rest for the rest of these. Okay, now I've got T-track set up on that. So, next part is to start working on the fence part. Okay, so I've got my dado stack set up again here to cut this groove for the T-track in the fence part. Now I'm going to cut it through the bottom of this Actually, I already made a cut, and what I should have done was made this cut in this when I did the other T-track slots on the baseboard. That's a tidbit for you, is if you watch this through before you do this, cut this T-track also while you've got everything else set up for doing the other T-tracks. Cut. T-track fits in very nice and snug, and it's just barely below the wood, so it won't interfere with anything. Next, what I'll do is get this fastened in here, all the screws tightened down, cut off the end, and then ready for the next steps. Okay, and as before on the other T-tracks, I'll drive in these number 6 by 3/8 screws. Get them snug, then hand tighten them so I don't over torque them and break the screws. I'll get a couple of these in and then I'll finish them up. Okay, as I did with the other T-tracks on the other board, lined up my kerf here, went through, trimmed that off, got it good and flush. My next step is going to be putting some slots in here for these T-bolts to fit into when they're in these tracks down there. And they're going to be 1 1/8" long slots, 5/16 inch wide. And that's going to allow this to be able to move around a little bit on there. The way I've got this set up is, this is the front end of the jig. And at the back end here, there's going to be some other hardware and stuff mounted on there to facilitate doing like tapered legs, which I'll be covering later on in this video. Like I said, these slots, this one, and this end one, are going to be 1 1/8" long. And what I'll do is I've got this set up here, so this is even with the front end here. And I'm going to mark kind of like the center where these T-slots are at down below. Then I'll base centering my slots based on those marks. This end one here, it's going to be an open slot here, so it's going to come into 7/8 inch because it's very close to the edge of this T-slot and it doesn't have to be in that far. Mark these up. Next, I'm going to get the spots marked for where I need to make these slots at, drill the end holes of the slots, and then use a router to clean up the spaces between those slots. I'm marking up and laying out where my slots are going to be on this fence, and the plans don't really give you exactly where the center of these slots are supposed to be located on the board. But viewing the plans and how they got things pictured, I kind of made a guess at it. The layout here for this brass threaded insert to go into in the end of this board here, on the plans it's 1 3/4 in from this edge here. So I've got that marked out. Then I gave myself another 1/2 inch to figure out the beginning edge where the slots are going to be at. It's going to be a 5/16 inch slot, so I measured out the other end of that, and then the center, 5/16 divided by 2 is 3/16. Kind of sounds like funny math, but it actually works out. Got that set up there. Now what I'm doing is measuring from this edge into the center where my slots are going to be, and that comes up at 2 9/16 inches to be on center. Now, as you remember before, I made these marks on here to center on the T-tracks on the base. So I went through with this, set my square at 4 inches, and then what I'll do is set it on that mark, then I'll measure in 2 9/16 inches and mark that as the center where I'm going to make the center of the slot at. Then from that point I can measure out from that center to each end here 9/16 inch. 1 1/8 divided by 2 is 9/16 inch. So that'll give me my stopping points for these slots. That'll be where I will line up my holes that I'll drill in here. Then I'll clean up the space between there with a router bit. And that'll be the same thing with the next slot and the next slot. Here at the drill press, I'm going to drill the end holes for the slots that I'm going to make. So I'm trying to carefully line this up so that the tip of the brad point falls center on the line that I drew in there, and then the outer edge of the drill bit's going to fall on that outer mark that I need to get. So I'll do this in the other end. Line up the other one here. Okay. So, as you can see, got these centered on the lines there, and the edge of the holes are matching up with these outer limit lines. Now we'll go on and Drill the same for the rest of the slots. Then I'll go to the router and make some straight cutouts between those holes. My next step here is to lengthen these holes here. These are 5/16 holes that I'm making for those hold down knobs. And what I do is I've got the 2 holes drilled, so I'm going to carefully line up a straight edge and draw lines across to line the edges of those holes. Fine point pencil here, 0.5 millimeter. So now I've got those lines across there. Then what I'll do is some double stick tape, stick on these guides and line them up with those marks on each side. And that'll give me a guide for this bearing bit here to cut that hole. This is a 1/4 inch by 1 inch cut length and a 1/4 inch shank, and a couple passes with that because it's a little bit smaller than the 5/16 holes I'm doing here in slots. So a couple passes with that on each side, that'll give me my 5/16 slots for the bolts. Okay, I've put my double stick tape on the back side of these 2 guides I'm using, which is just 1/4 inch thick MDF, and I've got my bit height set so that the guide bearing will ride along this MDF here. So I peel these off, then line these up with the pencil marks and stick them in place. Okay, but now what I'll do is I'll set this over on my bit, get that protruding up through there, get it fairly lined. I'm going to turn on my router, make passes on each side, and try and clean up, round up the edges at the ends. Take this off, pry off the guides here, take off the tape that's sticking here. There, I've got a perfect fitted slot. Now we'll go on and do the other 3. Okay, so I've got all of these slots cut. Next step is to do some work on the end here, putting in a brass threaded insert. Okay, I've cut this stop that goes at the back end of this jig for setting up tapered legs, and this measures 1.5 inches wide by 4 3/4 inches long here, and it's a 3/4 inch thick stock. So I've marked up where I'm going to drill my holes for 5/16, and I'm going to make the slots between those holes, and this one here. Then on the back side or the front side, however you look at it, I'm going to make a 1/2 inch dado, 1/4 inch deep. So I'll move on to the drill press, get some of these holes drilled, then to the router and route out the slots. Okay, I use my scribe to mark the points here at these cross marks where I want to drill my holes at. That way I can kind of get my bit started in there. So I will drill these out, go on from there to the router. A little bit of sanding to clean up some of these rough spots and move on to the router. Okay, on this one, because these holes are so precariously close to the edge here, I need to add a little extra support on this, so I cut a piece of MDF that will fit on level with that. That way I can attach another piece on top of there, and it's got more support with that extra piece on there. Then also for the other piece, I'm going to stick that on here. So as before, I'm going to draw some lines here to connect the holes and give me a guideline for positioning these guides. Stick this piece on the side here to give me support. And this one I'll position on here to line up with that line. I kind of tilt it in, get the edge on there, position, then I tilt it back and down and press it in place. Then I'll get this other one on here. Okay, then I'll set these onto the router bit here and trim it out. Now I'll do the same for the other 2 holes, cut another slot. Okay, so on this stop block, I got these slots cut out and routed out in my router, and then I came to the table saw here and just used my fence, raised my blade to 1/4 inch, and then I just notched out to make a dado, a 1/2 inch wide dado, 1/4 inch deep, lining up on my fence here and just keep moving it over a little bit until I've got the dado completed to the size and depth that it calls for. Here I forgot to have my sound turned on, so what I'm doing here is I'm cleaning up any burrs and stuff. This is a scrap piece of metal I had from some other project. So I'm cleaning off the burrs with the file, and what I want to do is line up the edge here with the saw kerf on my miter board here and trim off the edge so I've got a good square edge to work with. Now file off some of the burrs again here. Then I'm going to measure in the length that I need this to be. Then I'll line that up with the saw kerf again on my miter gauge and cut that. A little bit proud of the length I need it to be. Then I'll sneak up on the sizing, how it fits into the dado that I want to fit this into. This is what I'm using to make into my miter slot nut. So I'll fit that in there. It's a little bit tight, so I'm going to size it a little bit further. Okay, I marked and center punched where I want to have the center of my hole at. So I'm going to put it on here. I'll line up the tip of the drill bit here. Then I'll drill this. Working with such a small piece, need something here to hold this with to make it safe. There we go. So got that drilled. Next I'll tap out the 1/4 inch thread on there. Got that, and what I'll do is clean up from the drilling any burrs that might be on there. Then going to take my tap and thread this through here. Tap out the hole. Make sure I get a relatively straight start here. Back up a little bit to clear out some of the filings or shavings. Okay, now it's got to the point where it's threaded through, so that works good. Okay, now the bolt will screw into there. This will be part of that jig for doing like tapered legs and stuff, whereas this will be fitting into that slot. As such, got it filed down to fit fairly well here, and then the bolt will go through, thread into that, and that'll be a pivot point for doing those legs and stuff, or multiple tapers. Got that part all done. Next step is back to the fence where I have to drill a hole to put in that threaded brass insert. Okay, here I've ready to put that brass threaded insert into the end of this fence board. Did some testing and stuff to find out, what size hole is going to work best for doing this brass insert. Also found out how fragile these brass inserts are. This broke off as I had the hole a little too small, so I was putting a little too much torque on it, so kind of broke an end off on it. Luckily I've got a spare here since the package contains 2. And did some more experimenting with another hole, and found that the best size bit for doing this is an 11/32. So I've set my depth on my drill bit here, and I'm going to drill this down to be a little bit deeper than the length of that threaded insert. This is pretty easy to eyeball and keep straight. I'm not real concerned about this hole being real tight. I want it to be somewhat of a loose fit, as that brass insert breaks too easily. And to get it to hold well, once I get everything done, and I'll remove the insert and then I'll put it in with some epoxy glue to hold it in place. Blow out some of the sawdust. I'll get this one threaded in there using a large screwdriver. So once I get it down in there a ways successfully, because you want to get a good straight start here, so it's going in pretty good. I want to keep it going fairly straight, slow and easy, so you don't, if you wind up into too much pressure, you don't want to take a chance on breaking this brass. I'm down to a point here now where the blade of the screwdriver is hitting the wood that surrounds it. So that's going to create some extra difficulty. So now I'm going to back it out, and I'm going to use a chamfer bit to open this up a little bit here on the end, so it makes it easier to get it in there. That won't make it loose because eventually I'm going to epoxy this thread in there. Don't need to do much. Get this in there and then get it all the way down. where that's going to be good and flush, a little bit below the surface. So that's great. Now I'll take this out, and I'll put some epoxy on the threads and screw it back in there. What I want to show you here is this end block mechanism for doing like tapered legs and other kinds of tapers, and how this works, because it allows you to do tapers and get this rotated like the leg and get the same exact taper on each side of the leg without having to take your cutoffs and wedging them in there to try and keep your angle. It's not always a perfect method. Sometimes because of your cuts, that piece you wedge in there might be a little bit off. This helps to eliminate that problem. This slides across back and forth so you can just, where you want your leg to be at. Of course, all this will be over closer to the edge here. So you can rotate. It depends how big a leg you're doing or how small of a leg you're doing. You can adjust that over. And what this does is this screws in here and it comes out on the other side as a pin that will locate in the bottom of your leg so as to give a pivot point for when you're turning your legs to do the different tapers. Now I'll take this off here and show that to you. Now this is in that plate that I made, the slotted T-nut, and you can tighten this in to extend it in however far you want or back out. Once you figure out a point where you want, then you can take this other end here, tighten up this elastic stop nut to keep and hold it in that position that you want. Now something else that I've done here is, because I'm using these woodpecker knobs on here, I found that because of the shape of these, they come down too far against the top of this, and it causes a restriction, and I can't tighten that down far enough. I thought about trimming this down a little bit further, but I don't want to get too close to this slot here and weaken that. So what I did is I put in a longer T-bolt in here, then I put a couple of 3/8 nuts in here because it's a 5/16 T-bolt. Put a couple of 3/8 nuts to slip in over there to serve as spacers, and then another washer up here, and that allows me to be able to tighten down this to tighten down the fence, not have to worry about restricting on this. That's how that works, and how it can do table legs, get the exact same taper all the time just by rotating on this pin, not having to space or shim anything, and you'll be a lot more exact. Well, thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, you got the inspiration to make something, please give me a like and share it with your family, friends, and fellow craftspersons. Also, if you want to see what I may come up with next, please subscribe. And remember, if the ladies don't find you handsome, at least they should find you handy. Thank you.